Hey, welcome back to session 7 of Best Life Ever, our series on the 10 Commandments. God's ways are always better. You get tired of hearing that? I love saying it because it reminds me that God has good things in our lives, that He really does want us to have the best life ever, and that His guidelines, His instructions, if you will, are really meant to get top performance out of our life. You know, when you get a different car, or maybe a new car, if you're fortunate enough for that, you ought to read the manual because every car has its nuances and it has certain ways that it operates at its highest and its best level. If you have a high performance vehicle, you need to put high performance fuel in it, because otherwise it's going to be knocking and sputtering and you're going to wonder, why did I pay all this money for this car? It's not running like it's supposed to, because you need to put the right things into it. You say, well, that's too restrictive. Well, men and women, things are geared to operate at a high performance level, and you can't put water, right now anyways, you can't put water into a gasoline run vehicle. You have to use the right kind of fuel in your life. So listen, the same thing is true about you. Do you realize that God created you as a high performance person? He wants you to operate at the highest level. And if you're going to do that, you need to understand how you work best. God has these things laid, these guidelines, these principles, these instructions laid out for us in Scripture. They're the 10 Commandments and much, much more. But we're talking about the 10 Commandments, of course, in this study series together. So let's get to the 7th commandment. This is one that is another really direct forward thing, and it is one that helps our relationships be the best. Here it is, very simply, Exodus 20, verse 14, you shall not commit adultery. Wow, you know, that's pretty straightforward, and even in this day of liberated thinking and liberated lifestyles, this is one of the most painful things that relationships could go through, the betrayal and the brokenness that happens when we allow our love to go someplace else. As a matter of fact, most of the time in my working with people and families and couples, when there's a couple that comes in and there seems to be some unspoken thing that keeps them from moving forward, most of the time there's a third person, there's another person involved that's kind of a secret that is preventing people from wanting to move forward in your life. I have this opinion, and I think it's one of the things I'll ask God when I get to heaven to validate it. I think God made man and woman to be monogamous. Most people cannot carry on multiple relationships. Now, I know that there's a few people out there. I know that there's exceptions to every rule. But in my observations, here's what typically happens. We can have a couple that has a solid marriage. Let's say at least a solid marriage, maybe even a good marriage. And then something happens, some third person comes into the marriage and pays some extra attention to either husband or the wife in the marriage. And normally the moment that happens, if that goes beyond anything beyond a brief flirtation and becomes something of an infatuation, what happens is in this previously healthy marriage, the person that is now kind of being seduced away by the attention of another person, what happens so many times is that they begin to look at their current spouse in nothing but negative light. They can't see the good in them anymore. Why is that? Why does that happen? It's because we're really geared to be monogamous. And when our heart starts to be shifted away and goes someplace else, guess what? We develop a bad attitude. It's kind of our way of justifying our behavior. We don't do well most people don't do well trying to handle multiple relationships. And all of a sudden, something that was good begins to become broken. Well, Jesus again speaks to this issue because he really talks about adultery, and he says, adultery doesn't start with the action, it starts in the heart. Can we go back, as we did in one of our previous sessions, can we go back again to the Sermon on the Mount? Let's look at Matthew chapter 5, verse 27. Jesus takes the issue right to the heart of the matter. He doesn't let us get away with much, all right? Not that he's trying to keep us from having a great life. Quite the opposite. He's trying to point out how much we need to be healed and set free in our life. Matthew chapter 5, verse 27, you can follow along with me if you'd like. Here's what Jesus says. I know Jesus said it because it's in red in my Bible. Here we go. You have heard that it was said to those of old, you shall not commit adultery. That's the commandment we just read. Verse 28. But I say to you that whoever looks at a woman to lust for her has already committed adultery with her in his heart. Now we could stop there and realize that, oh my gosh, if there's something in my heart that has me betraying the person I'm committed to, then there's something wrong within me. And you would be exactly right, because that's not God's best ways, all right? It doesn't say that you won't notice people and that certain people might be more attractive to you in some ways. Hey, that happens to everybody. That's part of being human. But what you do with that does become important. Now, I'm going to read you a couple more verses only because they point out the severity of not dealing with sin in our life. How, in God's world, how important and crucial this is. Listen to what Jesus says as we pick it up in verse 29. If your right eye causes you to sin, pluck it out and cast it from you. For it is more profitable for you that one of your members should perish than for your whole body to be cast into hell. And one more, verse 30. And if your right hand causes you to sin, cut it off and cast it from you. For it is more profitable for you that one of your members perish than for your whole body to be cast into hell. So the question I would have for you is, how come more of us aren't blind or limbless in some way? The truth of the matter is, Jesus doesn't want us mutilating ourselves, but he does want us to be aware of how debilitating and destructive sin really is. He said it is so awful what it does to people and lives and families. What it does in these situations is really, truly so awful, men and women, that he says you would actually be better in a sense if you didn't have any eyes. So he wants us to be that. Jesus will teach by extremes on occasion, and this is one of those extremes. So when we talk about adultery, which is the breaking of the covenant relationship, it's one of those things that is offensive not only to your spouse, but it is offensive to God as well. Now let me take just a moment. You may not be married. Maybe you've never been married. Maybe you were married. But let me talk to you about this, because I think that the problems that happens in family are so, there's such a common denominator in how things happen. So I'm going to talk to you real briefly about what I would call the anatomy of an affair. Here we go. It starts with a distraction. Something happens in our life and we begin to look elsewhere. It could be some sort of frustration or disappointment or brokenness in our life. Something happens in our life and we begin to look elsewhere. There's a distraction. And with that distraction comes some sort of attraction. Somebody gets our attention. By the way, as I mentioned to you a few moments ago, it's not the first look that is the problem. It's the second look. It's when you go back to take another look that things start to happen in your life. There's some sort of attraction. Most people there are people in your life that you are naturally attracted to and you have an affinity with. But what you do with that is so important. So there's a distraction, it leads to an attraction, and then that usually leads to some sort of infatuation. And that's when the hook is set, so to speak. If we were fishing, it's when, you've been looking at the bait, you've been sniffing around it, and then that's the time that you've actually bit into it. And that's an infatuation. When you get infatuated with somebody who's not your spouse, that hook is set. Usually at some point in time that results in some sort of action or some sort of infraction against the Lord and against your spouse. And then you have all of the reactions that happens as a result of breaking this commandment. What are you going to do to be successful then? How are you going to affair-proof or adultery-proof your marriage? All right? Here's some suggestions to you. Number one, think beyond the immediate moment to the long-range view of your life. What is your life about, and what is going to be the impact? Here's another suggestion. Know the times in your life when you're vulnerable. Maybe it's when you're tired. Maybe it's after a great victory. Maybe you're vulnerable if you have gotten a lot of attention. Maybe you're vulnerable if you're traveling. Know your vulnerable spots and protect yourself. Make a wise plan to protect yourself against your vulnerabilities. All right? Here's another tip. Extinguish the flames of unfaithfulness immediately. Hey, it's easy to blow out a match. It's difficult to put out a full raging fire. So extinguish those flames of infatuation immediately. And here's one more tip. Embark on a lifelong journey to invest in your marriage. What do you mean by that, Pastor? Listen, marriage is an organic living relationship. And you're always going to have to take care of it. You know, one seminar, back in the second year of marriage, and you've been married 15 years, is probably not going to do it. Keep yourself up to date and up to speed on what builds good marriages and what you're going to do in your life, in your marriage. Plan those special times together. Plan vacations together. Let your kids know that your spouse is the most important person in their life. If you're going to build a great marriage, you have to always take care of it. Even if you've had a great marriage, let's say for 20 years, you're thinking, I've had a great marriage for 20 years, I shouldn't have to do this anymore. Well, as I've said many times, if you have a garden or a yard or something that's organic that you appreciate, just leave for a month and don't have anybody take care of it. And when you come back, guess what you're going to find? Weeds and overgrowth and things you don't want to see and all kinds of stuff. Why? Because organic things are living things and they have to be nurtured and taken care of in order to be healthy and alive. So I pray that in your discussion time together that you're going to dig in and discover some interesting and some important truths about how to really work on building faithfulness in your life, faithfulness to your spouse, faithfulness to your family, faithfulness to the Lord. Hey, it's all wrapped up together anyway. Can't wait to see you next time at Session 8.